Hello everyone, welcome back and thank you very much for joining me for my concluding thoughts on Pacific Battles Malaya. I have, since my last video, now played through to the end of the campaign, and I did try a second one just to make sure my conclusions from the first game were not too skewed one way or another. Overall, I'm rather sorry to say that this game has left me quite disappointed. It looks gorgeous. As I've said before, the map is beautiful. A few place names are spelled wrong again. It seems to be an endemic problem with games to do with the Singapore and Malaya campaign, but what can you do? But it's not the graphics that are the problem. It is, if there's one particular offender I can single out first, it is this, the rules. There's no really polite way to say this, but this game could have done with a lot more development, and what you get in this is barely acceptable in a magazine game. If this had been an expensively packaged boxed game, I would probably have been wanting my money back. The game has a lot of problems. The first is that it's part of a series, so the designer, Joseph Miranda, basically created a combat system on which he intended to hang a large number of battles in the Far East and the Pacific. Fair enough, if you can make it work. The Malaya campaign is the fourth one in this series, so you'd have thought that the kinks would be worked out. And how it functions is that each rulebook contains the core rules for the series. And then at the very back, you have the scenario-specific rules, which sometimes tweak, other times completely override the basic rules you're given. And this can lead to a bit of confusion. So if you read through the rulebook in the basic rules, it tells you that you can stack a certain number of units together. I think the basic game said 6 battalions. Okay, fine, six battalions. That is a reasonable number depending on the geography. However, if you get to the very last page and it's only in small text, so it's easy to miss, you're suddenly told that the stacking limit for Malaya and Singapore is 9 battalions. Now that's a massive game changer, because if you're playing 6 battalions, you're going to be corralled into smaller unit actions. And the Japanese in particular are not able to make a convincing use of their ability to concentrate overwhelming strength at a point of contact. Now this was very important for them in historically winning the Malaya campaign. If you miss that critical rule, and I did at first, I must admit, here the going is much more difficult. Another problem I have is that the rules are not very clear on what suppression is. There's a combat result, a bombardment result, whereby units are suppressed. Now in the case of a headquarters, they're deactivated, which can unhinge a player's plans. But in the basic rules, it says you have suppression markers. You don't actually get these in the game. And one is left wondering whether suppression is supposed to have any effect or not. Squirreled away in one tiny other area of the rules is the fact that suppressed units award a column bonus to the enemy when you're consulting the combat results table. Great if you find it, but if it's not in an obvious place, this rule. Another one is the 6 turns. Now, apparently, I've not played any of the other games in this series, but I have heard that the 6 turn limit is a feature of every game in this series. And when you try and shoehorn a campaign into a system, there are some things that simply do not work. Forcing the Malaya campaign into a 6 turn limit is one of them, because the obvious question is how on earth are the Japanese supposed to achieve all their objectives? They can do it if they face no opposition whatsoever. Very difficult otherwise. If the British put up any sort of fight anywhere, the chances of a Japanese win are not great. The game does get around this in a way that infuriates me even more, and that's in the setup. There is no option for historical unit setup so that you get to understand the ramifications of the British deployment and the Japanese plans. Fair enough if the game wants to give you free historical deployment, but in a historical war game, you should at least have an option of stepping into the shoes of the commanders of the time. You can do that with this game if you put in the research and try and match it up to the hex numbers and try and get units in the right place. But it's a lot of effort, and to be honest, there are better games that do that for you. The setup as given in the rulebook is actually rather atrocious because at the beginning of the game, the Commonwealth forces are not allowed to deploy closer to the southern Malayan town of Johor, which is just north of Singapore, than to the Thai border. And what this means in practice is that from the beginning of the game, as the Commonwealth player, if you draw an imaginary line from the capital, Kuala Lumpur, and look south, you are not allowed to garrison the southern half of the country, except for the garrison at Singapore. So you have this huge open space and loads of your forces up in the north, which is completely ahistorical. The British did have garrisons down in the south. They were particularly looking after the ports of Kuantan and Mersing. These were all important places, and they suspected would make good landing sites for the Japanese. They were trying to cover all their bases. The game does not permit you to place a garrison in Mersing. Just to make matters worse, if you read the rules as given, the Japanese units start the game off-map in their invasion transports, but they can land anywhere they like. They are not locked into the historic plan of landing at Singora, Patani, Johor Bahru up in the north. Sorry, not Johor Bahru, Kota Bahru up in the north. There's none of that. I mean, they can if they want to, but equally, if they want to, they can land at Singapore Island. It's completely nuts. Yes, they did historically have the option to do that, but for very good reasons, they chose to place their invasion in the north. So what this game ends up becoming is not so much a historical recreation of the Malaya-Singapore campaign, but something that can descend into a weird, swirling free-for-all, almost a dogfight with infantry units as people wander up and down this map picking fights with each other. And the only thing that's guiding their strategy is the presence of these funny little gold stars, which would make more sense if you had rules that reflected the historic supply situation, particularly the British dependence on roads. As I said in the previous video, the supply rules in this game are just crazy. There is no problem if British forces are cut off as long as they have a port nearby. And yet historically, the British struggled to have enough transport capacity to supply their forces by sea. It's why they were so dependent on the roads. None of that's reflected. Forces in Penang can last until they're destroyed to the last man, as long as they keep the port open. No, I'm sorry. Finally, to rub even more salt into the wound, there are the bizarre tactical rules that this game includes. And other people have complained about this as well, but the one that really gets me is that if a player begins their turn with enemy units adjacent to them, they must attack them. There's no option about this. You must attack. Now, what effect does this have? It means that a canny Japanese player who starts the game with the initiative simply has to march his troops up adjacent to a Commonwealth position. If he approaches via the jungle, he is not obliged to attack them because most Commonwealth units don't exert a zone of control into jungle, but he exerts one out of it and into jungle. Now, to the non-gamers out there, that must sound a bit gobbledygooky, but Essentially, what it means is the Japanese player in the early part of the game just has to march up to heavily defended Commonwealth positions and sit there, knowing full well that the next turn the Commonwealth player would be obliged to get up out of his sometimes very strong defensive positions and attack him for no good reason other than, well, the rule book says so. It's completely nuts and it ruins the game. On my second trial, I didn't pick up on this so much in my first game, but on the second game, I thought, right, that's a rule. I'm going to be a bit of a rules lawyer and see how this works out. And the Japanese just stomped their way down the peninsula. I could have gone a bit faster, to be honest, just forcing Commonwealth units to commit seppuku left, right, and centre. And there's very little the British can do about it. It completely ruins the game. The designer offers no rationale for what drives that rule. Why is it there? Other than a throwaway line in the rule book that says it's historical. I'm sorry. I can tell you, Mr. Miranda, if you read any of the literature about the Singapore campaign, yes, there may have been small-scale local counterattacks by the British to try and recover lost ground, but you will not find many. In fact, I'll be surprised if you find any examples of brigades leaving defensive positions to confront the Japanese head-on. You might just want to read up on that a little bit. I could go on. There's a couple of other things, but I think I've probably said enough to give you the idea that this game has some rather serious issues. It is a real shame because, as I've said, it's beautiful. The map is gorgeous. The counters are gorgeous. For a magazine game, the production quality is really high. It's just attempting to play it with the rules as given that turn it into a bit of an epic tragedy. Am I going to get rid of this game? I try not to let go of games too easily. No, I'm not. What I'm going to try doing is maybe sit down, have a think about it, and attempt maybe not a rewrite of the rules, but a reinterpretation. Because I think there is so much that is good hiding in this design, but it has been badly abused by some rather abominable core series rules, and it's been forced to fit them, and it just does not work. Now, maybe the fact that I'm very familiar with this campaign is my problem. I expect certain things to be just so. Maybe if I knew nothing about the Malaya and Singapore campaign, it would be an incredibly fun game. In some respects, it is an incredibly fun game. But the trouble is when you know too much and when you see weird things like the Japanese, I don't know, mind controlling their British opponents and forcing them to attack at terrible disadvantages, or the British swanning around happily, not giving a monkeys about supply because all of a sudden supply is just there. It loses its character. It's not the campaign for Malaya or Singapore as I know it. So on that basis, I'm going to unfortunately give this game a rather low rating. I may try some other Joe Miranda designs in the future to see what I think of them. I mean, maybe this was just a fluke. He's produced lots of games. Maybe the others are amazing. Maybe I just caught him on a bad day. We'll see. But if you are a great fan or have a massive interest in the Malaya and Singapore campaigns and want decent, serious simulations of that campaign, I must warn you off this one. It is not worth the cost in frustration and teeth gnashing. And if you want a beautiful map to stick up on your wall, maybe see if you can just get the map secondhand. But otherwise, no. There are much better simulations of this campaign out there. But anyway, I'll stop flooding the channel with negativity. That was just my impression of this game. If I do succeed in rejigging it and making it better, I will naturally uh, publish that somewhere, probably on Board Game Geek, see what other people think. Someone might well beat me to it. I know others have thought this game is full of promise that it simply didn't deliver on, but it might be tweakable. So if you're interested in it, watch the space. But for now, I will leave that one there. Thank you very much. Bye.